these bodies. So a lot of things have happened in the last couple of years, and you can expect a lot of current affairs related questions out of this. And whenever people have discussed about United Nations, they've written plethora of articles in the Hindu and the Indian Express. I'd suggest that you guys also go through those articles, because if you look at the format of the CLAT exam that is being put forward by CLAT consortium, it's very likely that there'll be a passage which they might pick out of, let's say, the Hindu or the Indian Express, and then they will ask you questions out of that. So if you're able to read that passage in advance, because A, it is obviously very interesting, and B, it'll really help you to let's say, sort of skip that passage in the exam, and that will save a crucial 2-3 minutes. And that could essentially be a difference between you getting into NLSIU and you being stuck with Nalsar. Like, no offense to Nalsar, but I'm going to hold up my college name anyways. Okay. So let's just start with this lecture today. So the first thing that you need to know about the United Nations is that it is headquartered in New York, in New York, USA. Okay. So the idea of the United Nations came out right after the Second World War, right? So before the Second World War, after the First World War had happened, there had been like a sort of an organization that can loosely be referred to as as the predecessor of the United Nations, and this organization was the League of Nations. So the idea that was put forward is that humanity had seen a lot of destruction during World War I. A lot of people had died, and the general global consensus among all the leaders were that we should we should prevent humanity and our future and our children from the scourge of war. However, League of Nations had its own drawbacks. It couldn't prevent a lot of wars. It couldn't prevent the overtaking of Ethiopia by Italy. It couldn't prevent the overtaking of Manchuria region in China by Japan, right? And obviously, finally, it could obviously also not prevent the Second World War. So after the Second World War got over, the Allied Big Four, the Big Four, that is the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and China, who had played a decisive role in defeating the Axis, or the so-called evil powers during Second World War. These guys came together in this conference called Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944. So mind you that the World War got over in 1945, but they had already started discussing about what the future of mankind would be and what the future of global governance would be, right? Because at this point of time, they had realized that there would be certain challenges that mankind and all the nations will face, for which the foreign policy or for which the fiscal capability or the capabilities of any nation any specific nations will not be enough, and there will have to be a collective action, right? So for this, the United Nations formally came into existence on 24th October 1945. Okay? And so if you look at the membership of the United Nations, when United Nations started on 24th October 1945, it only had 51 countries. But by the end of July, the latest member, which is South Sudan, joined the United Nations on 14th July 2011. So as of now, United Nations has 193 members. Okay. Now, there are
Hello, sir.
yeah.
Sir, India was the founding member of United Nations?
Yeah, of course. India was the founding member of the United Nations just after
Yeah.
independence. Yeah,
So it
definitely.
has been asked once in a law examination.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Over to you, sir.
Okay. Yeah, just keep interjecting with these questions, because I haven't gone into the past year questions. So if you can bring up these things, that'll be really good.
Sure, sir. The first one was how many principal organs are there? The second is this
Yeah,
one.
that we'll figure out. Okay,
Sure,
thanks.
sure.
Okay. Right. So this is a brief background of the United Nations, like how it came about and how it exists and where its headquarters, etc., are located. Please remember, the United Nations has 193 members. Okay. So like entities, let's say like Palestine, and then you have the Holy See or the Vatican or Taiwan. They have not been able to become members of the United Nations because of certain political reasons, etc. Like, so I'll discuss about it later when we study about how the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council have veto powers, and they prevent a lot of, not a lot, prevent a few of them from becoming full-fledged member states. Like, for example, China blocks the entry of Taiwan into the United Nations because in China's idea, Taiwan is a part of China and it doesn't want the world to see Taiwan as a separate country, right? So obviously China would definitely veto the entry of Taiwan into the United Nations as a separate member nation. Okay. So um, so as of today, if you look at it from a practical standpoint, United Nations system is based on 5 principal organs. Okay. So there is also a 6th organ. So let's say if there is a question that how many principal organs exist in the United Nations as of today, so your answer obviously would be 6. But to understand how the United Nations function, you should understand that there are 5 functional principal organs. The first one is the United Nations General Assembly. Then you have the United Nations Security Council, of which India was recently elected as the non-permanent member. Then you have Economic and Social Council, also referred to as ECOSOC, and then the International Court of Justice and the UN Secretariat. Okay, so the 6th principal organ, it does exist on paper, right? Okay, but they call the Trusteeship Council. It does exist on paper, but it has suspended all operations in the sense that it has not done anything after 1994, because the entire idea of Trusteeship Council was that there were certain territories that belonged to the powers like Japan and Germany and other powers which are supporting them, which lost the World War, right? And these countries had to be either merged with any other countries, or they had to gain independence of their own. So Palau was the last country which declared independence in 1994, and after the last country was out of the pockets of the Trusteeship Council, there actually is no reason for the continued existence of the Trusteeship Council. So when I come to reforms in the United Nations, I will tell you what suggestions have been made in the sense that what can be done with the Trusteeship Council. But as of today, it's a dormant organ. So there are 5 functional organs. Okay. Now, in the United Nations, there are 6 official languages, and these are based on merely the number of people that speak these languages in the world. Okay, so you should know that there are 6 official languages, which are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. So I've clubbed them here so that you can always take in the sense, you can always mark in the question that there are 6 principal organs and there are 6 official languages. Okay, so now let's look at the main organs of the United Nations and what's been happening in these organs, which make these organs very relevant to your current affairs bit for this particular exam. Okay. So the first one is the United Nations General Assembly, where all the 139, 193 UN member states are represented. It is a deliberative, policy making, and representative organ of the UN, right? So the reason that I've highlighted deliberative is that the United Nations General Assembly generally doesn't have any powers, right? If it takes any decisions, if it passes any resolution, none of those are binding on anyone. So at best, it can, like, let's say, set up dialogue, it can divert the attention of the world to specific issues, and therefore it is a deliberative body in the sense that people go there, make speeches so that the world can listen to them. So it's basically like a platform for people and for countries and for representative of countries to give out their view to the entire world. Okay, so there is this person called Volkan Bozkır. He is a Turkish diplomat, and he has been elected as the president of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Okay, so one thing that you should know is that the sessions of the United Nations General Assembly usually happen around September. I don't know whether it will happen this year or not, because these are unprecedented times. The last pandemic that we had was in 1918, when the United Nations didn't exist. So let's see what happens in September, whether there will actually be this 75th session. But you should know the name of this guy, Turkish diplomat Volkan Bozkır. Okay, you should know that he's a diplomat from Turkey. Okay. So the primary role of the United Nations General Assembly, as I've discussed, says that since it's a deliberative body, it can express world opinion, it can promote international cooperation in various fields. Let's say, so there are things that go beyond particular countries, right? Like it can be a forum for discussions on climate change. It can be a forum for discussion on terrorism, because you need global convergence of thought, you need global convergence of interest to tackle these issues. Okay. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Palestine, Vatican City, and Taiwan are not a part of the United Nations General Assembly because of political and religious reasons. Okay. Now, why the United Nations General Assembly has become important is that this is the news that came out from today. Like, I was reading the newspaper today, and today it was revealed that India is now a founding member of an alliance for poverty eradication at the UN. Okay. So now this has been launched by the president of the 74th session. So this session happened in September 2019, but the next session will be in 2020. So the current powers exist with the 74th president. So they've launched this alliance for poverty eradication, and its primary focus is to make sure that once the COVID-19 pandemic is over, and like while it is also going on, they have to make sure that there is a boost in the global economy and there is recovery post the pandemic, right? That is the primary aim of this alliance. Now, as per the document put forward by this alliance, it says it will serve as a forum for member states to raise awareness about the danger that poverty poses to world peace, human rights, and sustainable development, right? So now that there is widespread inequality in the world, poverty obviously also also has a general national security implication, right? Because like, why would there be world peace if there is conflict between the classes? If the gap between the haves and have nots is increasing, why will the have nots be okay with the sort of system that we've allowed to develop, right? So there are bound to be consequences for this increasing inequality. So to put things into perspective, India's deputy permanent representative to the UN, you should try to remember his name, Ambassador Nagaraj Naidu. He said that he talked about like the increasing inequality in the world and the problem of poverty that the world faces. And he says that there are people in the world who are so hungry that for them the idea of God is not beyond the idea of bread. Okay, so he says global inequality is so deeply entrenched that there are only 2000 billionaires or 2000 people in the world who have more wealth than 60% of the entire planet, right? So this is what this Alliance for Poverty Eradication at the UN will try to fight. Okay, so this is something that you should remember, because the question could very easily be whether India is a founding member of this alliance or not. So this news came out today, so it's as relevant, as current as it can be. Now, the second or principal organ of the United Nations is the United Nations Security Council, right? So the primary job of the Security Council is to maintain peace and security amongst the countries, right? Now, the interesting thing is that the United Nations General Assembly can only make some sort of recommendations to the Security Council, right? There are no, like, it does, United Nations General Assembly, beyond deliberation and discussion, it really doesn't have any sort of powers, right? So the power to actually make decisions lies with the United Nations Security Council. Okay. Now, when United Nations Security Council makes those binding decisions, these binding decisions are called as the United Nations Security Council resolutions. So I want to give you two examples of United Nations Security Council resolutions, one which is very relevant to India, and the second one which will tell you how global politics is determined by the sort of resolutions these take. So the first is the UNSC resolution 47. This I think is very important because it relates to the resolution of the Kashmir conflict. So this resolution came out in 1948. So I think if you looked at news channels, if you try to look at narratives from the Pakistani side or from the separatists in Kashmir, they always keep on talking about this plebiscite or a referendum, and they say that United Nations had said in 1948 in resolution 47 that there should be a plebiscite in Kashmir. So this is the resolution that they're referring to. And for clarity, let me tell you, there were three conditions that were imposed by the United Nations Security Council in this resolution. The first condition that Pakistan hasn't fulfilled is that Pakistan, according to this resolution, has to first go outside of Pakistani occupied Kashmir. After Pakistan has gone out of Pakistani occupied Kashmir, the second condition is that after India verifies that Pakistan has left Pakistani occupied Kashmir, then India will make sure that the number of troops and the security presence is reduced to a bare minimum to what it is required to maintain law and order. And if these conditions are fulfilled, then there is the third condition of a plebiscite. And like we know, even the first condition has been fulfilled. So this Pakistani demand of a plebiscite or a referendum in Kashmir is baseless because they themselves are not going out of the Pakistani occupied Kashmir. Now, this is one resolution that pertains to India. Another very interesting resolution, I would say, is the United Nations Security Council resolution 1441. Okay. So prior to 2002, the United Nations Security Council had already passed 16 resolutions on Iraq, as when it was ruled by Saddam Hussein. So in 2002, they came up with this infamous resolution 1441, which basically said that this is the final warning issued to Iraq to get rid of its weapons of mass destruction and let the United Nations come in and monitor. Now, we know the truth today that there were never any weapons of mass destructions in Iraq, and the US used this resolution 1441 to make sure that they invaded to lead the invasion of Iraq, right? And that is one of the criticisms of the United Nations Security Council, that all these resolutions that they pass, and then there is this principle called responsibility to protect, under which if the United Nations Security Council believes that there are gross human rights violations, there is imminent conflict, then they can go there and protect those people, right? So this is one of the primary criticisms of the United Nations Security Council, that these resolutions are used as, like, let's say, methods of regime change, right? Because the primary idea behind the invasion of Iraq was that there are obviously weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now Iraq is devastated, it's been a cool 20 years and no weapons of mass destruction have ever been discovered, right? And then the US has and all the NATO allies have come up with this of this without any responsibility, because they put the blame back to the United Nations and say that, oh, the United Nations Security Council had passed this resolution 1441, and we were only fulfilling, let's say, the responsibility that we thought we had under this resolution. So these are the problems that you have with resolutions in the United Nations Security Council. Okay. So now let's look at the structural makeup of the United Nations Security Council. So it is made up of 15 members, out of which there are 5 permanent members. These are called the P5. Okay. So these 5 permanent members obviously are China, Russia, France, United Kingdom, and the United States. Okay. And now there are these 5 permanent members called P5, and then there are the 10 temporary members, right? So temporary members are elected for a term of 2 years. Okay. Now, the most important thing about the permanent members, apart from the fact that they're always present, they are permanent, is that they hold a veto power. So if the United Nations Security Council wants to deliberate on something and take a specific action, right? And mind you, United Nations Security Council is the most relevant forum of the United Nations, because only the United Nations Security Council has a binding effect on, those resolutions have a binding effect. So these P5 countries can restrict the passing of any sort of revolution or any sort of resolution. So if you think logically, then the issue with this is also particularly clear, right? These 5 countries basically can do whatever they want, and nobody can do anything against their actions, because the moment, let me give an example. Just say, for example, United, as in led by United States, some of the P5 countries wanted to pass a resolution on Syria, and they wanted to go into Syria, right? But Russia and China blocked this resolution, and they said that no, there is no point, because they blamed the US and said that you use resolutions and you use the responsibility to protect under Article 2 of the Charter to invade Libya, and you call the regime change there, which was not really required, right? So this is the sort of global politics that's played around this veto power, right? And interestingly, you should know that this veto power is something that Russia itself had proposed after the Second World War, because it said that I don't really trust you Western countries. So Russia wanted the veto power to be incorporated. And obviously, because this veto power gave everyone so much power, nobody really refused. Okay. Now, as I told you about the temporary seats, they are held for 2-year terms with 5 member states, which are voted by the General Assembly on a regional basis per year, right? And the presidency of the Security Council rotates alphabetically each month. Okay. So now the current affairs around this is that India has been elected to the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member from the Asia Pacific category, right? So I told you that nominations and elections are held according to the region. Now, interestingly, there was no competitor for India's bid as a member of the United Nations Security Council from the Asia Pacific region, right? And this is not the first time. Please remember, this is the 8th time that India has been elected to the United Nations Security Council. The last time it was elected was in 2011, 2012, right? Now, the reason that India got elected unopposed is because it was able to convince the other countries that India has its commitment to multilateralism and reform, right? So multilateralism basically means that there shouldn't be a unilateral decision in the UN, because one of the criticisms of the UNSC and the United Nations in general is that it's dominated by United States and the Western powers, which are its allies. So India says that it's going to push for reforms, and it's going to push for multilateralism, in the sense that there should be more deliberation and more representation. There should be voices from Asia, there should be voices from Africa, etc., when it comes to deciding the outcomes and the future of the global politics, right? Now, so India had come out with a campaign brochure wherein it said very basic things. It said we want transparency in the mandates for UN peacekeeping forces. Then it says that there should be a push for. So there is this, let's say, convention called the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism (CCIT), which India has been spearheading. So you should know that India is trying to bring about a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. Primarily, it sort of wants to target Pakistan, but it'll generally help the world to overcome its, as in it'll help the world in its global war on terrorism. So this is something that you should know, that India leads the fight for the Comprehensive Convention for International Terrorism. Then it says that India will support any and all joint efforts for UN reform and expansion of the Security Council. So according to the speech given by our Minister of External Affairs, he says that India will have a 5S approach. Okay. So the 5 S's are: first is Samman, which is respect. Then you have Samvad, which is dialogue. And then you have Sahyog, which is cooperation. And then Shanti, peace. And Samriddhi, which is prosperity, right? So these are fairly self-explanatory. Now, in the recent decades, so India has now become become a non-permanent member. But in the recent decades, India has also been making this stance that India should become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which I feel is very justified, because if you look at the permanent members, right, United Nations was formed in 1945. Initially, it had 51 members. Out of those 51 members, you had 5 permanent members. Now, the mandate of the United Nations covers 193 countries. So obviously, the veto power and the permanent membership should not be restricted to just these 5 countries. There should be other countries that should be made permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, to make sure that there are more representative discussions at this so-called political high table. Right. So to further this end, India is now a part of a group called the G4. You should know these countries in the G4 group: India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. Now, these countries also don't have a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. And if you look at the global dynamics, global geopolitical dynamics as they exist today, countries like Germany and Japan, they contribute the most to the United Nations after the US. And then India and Brazil are are emerging democracies, and like a large chunk of the world lives here. And you can't have, let's say, for example, if you take India's case, you can't have 1/6 of humanity's voice not present at the United Nations Security Council, right? Now, apart from this, India has also had a stellar record, and India is the largest provider of troops to the peacekeeping forces, right? So these are some reasons why India should become a permanent member. So in India's bid to become a permanent member, 2 things are important. First is the G4. So you should know about the countries, G4 countries: India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. And then there is another opposing group of countries, okay, called the consensus. One second. So its informal name is the Coffee Club. It came out in the 50s. It basically says that the United Nations Security Council permanent seats should not be expanded. They want more non-permanent members, because these countries believe that there is a fundamental problem with this sort of veto structure that exists, and they don't want more than 5 countries to have vetoes, because they think that if more countries are made permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, then whatever little work the United Nations has been doing correctly, that will also be hampered. Okay. Now, the third principal organ is the United Nations Secretariat. It is headed by the Secretary General. Now, Secretariat, as you understand, is very simple. It provides all data, information, research, facilities, etc., which are needed by the United Nations bodies for their meetings, right? So it's basically the intellectual and the physical workhorse of the United Nations. Now, apart from that, if there are any directions given to it by the Security Council, General Assembly, ECOSOC, or any other United Nations body, the United Nations Secretariat has the staff to carry out these functions. Okay. Now, the Secretary General is the de facto spokesperson, and he's thought of as the leader of the United Nations. Okay. Now, according to the United Nations Charter, it describes the position of the Secretary General of the United Nations as the Chief Administrative Officer, right? So, over the years, his role has diversified. He's also the administrative officer, and he's now also a seasoned global diplomat, and he basically he or she, whoever it may be, has the power to act as a mediator in a lot of conflicts in the world, because people will obviously want to if you have to have a deliberation or discussion, you would want, let's say, a moderator to be someone as unbiased as the United Nations Secretary General. Okay. Now, the Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly, but obviously this has to be recommended by the Security Council, right? So Security Council may, if any of the 5 members, they basically put in a veto, then a particular person cannot be made the Secretary General of the United Nations Secretariat. Okay. Now, current affairs wise, the current Secretary General is Antonio Guterres, who replaced Ban Ki-moon in 2017. Antonio Guterres was the Prime Minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002. So this is the stature of the sort of people that become United Nations Secretary Generals, right? These are big influential people, and these are the sort of people that have this much of intellectual and political heft to steer an organization this big. Okay. Now is a favorite CLAT topic, the International Court of Justice. Right? So ICJ is located at the Peace Palace in The Hague, Netherlands. It is a primary judicial organ of the United Nations. So remember I told you that the United Nations headquarters is in New York, USA. So all the other primary organs are based out of New York. ICJ is the only organ that is not located in New York. Okay, it is located in the Peace Palace in Hague. So ICJ is composed composed of 15 judges, and they serve a 9-year terms. Okay, and they are appointed by the United Nations General Assembly, obviously subject to the approval of the United Nations Security Council. Okay, now one of the requirements is that out of these 15 judges, obviously they should belong to different countries. So Justice Dalveer Bhandari, who is a former Supreme Court of India judge, is a judge at the ICJ, and he's been recommended by India, and his nomination has been completed, and he is now serving his second term as a judge in the ICJ. So Mr. Dalveer Bhandari is an important name here. So the ICJ's primary purpose is to adjudicate disputes among states. Okay, and when it comes to issues like issues related to war crimes, issues related to, let's say, illegal interference by third parties or different states, what is this marker on the screen, or ethnic cleansing and other issues, these are sort of issues that the ICJ tends to handle. Okay, now apart from actually solving disputes, any organ of the United Nations can call upon the ICJ to give, let's say, its advisory opinion on certain facts. Now, one of the primary issues with the ICJ is the question whether ICJ decisions are actually binding or not, right? So, as per the United Nations Charter, the moment a state signs up to be a part of the United Nations, they undertake to comply with the decision of the court in any case to which it is a party. Okay. However, now the court does not have any direct powers to ensure implementation of its judgment. Right? So let's say the International Court of Justice says X, and a country says no, I don't really want to do it. The only way that the ICJ can do something is by requesting the United Nations Security Council to make sure that the judgment is carried forward. And I think now you can logically see the problem here, right? Now there is, and I'm not making this up. There are precedents, there are examples here where certain countries have refused to abide by the by the ICJ judgment. The prime example is the United States of America, right? So in 1986, basically there was a political issue between the United States and Nicaragua. It was so the fact-finding body of the ICJ, and finally at the adjudication after the findings of the fact-finding body was that United Nations had basically supported some rebels, and it was trying to, let's say, topple the Nicaraguan government. So the ICJ said that the United States is clearly at fault. Now United States is a P5 member country. The only way that any action can be taken against United States is if United States agrees for any action by the world community to be taken against it, because it has the veto power. So there is a problem like this. Similarly, in 2016, the ICJ had basically rejected all of China's claims in the South China Sea. But again, for any sort of, let's say, action to be carried out for this, the United Nations Security Council has to come forward, and China has a veto in the United Nations Security Council. So all these decisions of the ICJ, they are binding, but in the sense that there's a moral force, and let's say if there's a let's say P5 country, these decisions might be binding on them. But today we live in such sort of a multipolar world where there are multiple balancings, where countries make strategic bets and strategic adjustments with each other. I think it's really, really hard for any of these ICJ judgments to be enforced, especially if it's against belligerent nations like China or Russia. And this is the biggest problem which undermines the legitimacy of the ICJ. Okay. Now the fifth serving primary organ is the Economic and Social Council, or the ECOSOC. Now its primary function is to assist the General Assembly in promoting international economic and social cooperation and development. Okay, so ECOSOC has 54 members, which are elected by the UN General Assembly for 3-year terms. Okay, now its functions are very simple: information gathering, advising member nations, and making recommendations. Now, if you look at these functions, these are so broad, right? And the mandate of the ECOSOC is also so broad that basically nothing ever happens. It does so many things that it's not able to specialize in anything. And because it has its foot everywhere, it's not able to accomplish anything. So a lot of people, a lot of authors, a lot of jurists say that basically ECOSOC is an unfocused and an irrelevant body, right? So there's not really much to be discussed here. And then the sixth organ that I talked to you about is the Trusteeship Council, which is basically dormant as of today, because the last trusteeship territory that they had, which is Palau, is now an independent nation. Okay. So after looking at the structure of the United Nations, let's try to look at the objectives of the United Nations and how far those have been carried out, right? So remember, I told you in the beginning of this video that the idea of the United Nations was not to create heaven on earth, but it was to ensure that there is also no creation of hell here, right? And I think if you look at it that way, I think they've done a fair job. There are obviously reasonable and very true criticism of the role of the United Nations. It has obviously faltered, but I think it's done a decent job with regards to, let's say, handling conflicts, preventing some sort of genocide. Obviously, there are other genocides like the Rwandan genocide, etc., where the United Nations couldn't do anything. Now, these problems obviously are much bigger, and there are multiple political forces at play in those conflicts, right? So the first job is peacekeeping. Okay, so the United Nations, after obviously approval from by the UNSC, I'm sorry, I've made a spelling mistake. It sends peacekeeping forces to regions where armed conflict has recently taken place. Right. So let's say hypothetically, country A and country B enter into a war, but after fighting, they realize that it is futile. There is no need for war, and both countries. So this term de-escalation has been in the news recently with regards to India and China. So let's say these countries decide to de-escalate. Now, these countries can request the United Nations to send in an independent third party, which is the United Nations peacekeeping forces, right? Because obviously, let's say if there is a area, if there are forces from country A and country B, there are bound to be conflicts. Like tempers can flare up at any point of time, and it can have severe human rights consequences. But if you have an independent third party, which is the United Nations peacekeeping forces, then the possibility of resolution of these conflicts is much higher. Okay. And obviously United Nations does not maintain its own military, so there is no United Nations military force, right? So these peacekeeping forces members are provided by the member states of the United Nations. Here, over the period of 50 years, India has been the largest contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping forces. Now, because these soldiers wear blue caps and blue helmets, there is a distinctive name that they have called the blue helmets or the blue berets, right? So this is what you should remember, that the United Nations peacekeeping forces are also referred to as blue helmets or blue berets. Okay. Now, the peacekeeping forces as a whole, they've received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1988. Okay. Now, obviously, it's not a perfect body, but there was a study in 2005 by this corporation in the US called the RAND Corporation, which said that United Nations has been successful in 2 out of 3 peacekeeping efforts, right? So a 66% rate of preventing conflict and preventing genocides and preventing further escalation of wars, I think is a phenomenal job that the United Nations peacekeeping forces have done, right? So recently, the peacekeeping forces, especially the Indian contingent in the peacekeeping forces, was in news because in May 2020, an Indian female major called Suman Gawani, right, and she and a Brazilian naval officer was presented with this award called the United Nations Military Gender Advocate of the Year 2019 award. Okay, now this award was created in 2016, and it basically recognizes the contributions made by the UN peacekeeping forces. Now, Major Suman was presented this award for her outstanding contribution in the United Nations mission in Sudan. Okay, so she is the first Indian to receive this award, and this is a fairly new award constituted in 2016. So you should note that there's an award like this, United Nations Military Gender Advocate Award, and an Indian major has won this in 2019. Okay. Now, the next important role of the United Nations Security Council, of the United Nations, is in the field of human rights. Okay, so in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, which basically says that civil, political, and economic rights have to be granted to all human beings. Now, obviously, this is not binding, but there are 2 other important treaties. One is the 1966 ICCPR. Okay, and then there is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So all of these emanate from the sort of declaration and the sort of steps that United Nations have taken forward. So this in the entire human rights regime, United Nations, I believe, has done a phenomenal job. Okay, now obviously in practice, it's not able to take significant action. Then there are human right abuses, but it is able to form an independent fact-finding body and present the facts to the world. Now, similarly, in 1979, they had the United Nations General Assembly adopted the CEDAW, which is Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And then in 1789, they had a Convention on the Rights of Right of the Child, right? So after these discussions and deliberations happen in the United Nations General Assembly, and after they adopt these conventions, on the member states to make sure that there are legislation in their respective countries to reflect these global thoughts that have emerged at the United Nations General Assembly, right? Let me give you a very simple example of this. So in 2016, the United Nations Human Rights Council reached a resolution which condemned disruption of internet access by governments, right? So UN gave two particular examples. It says that discusses thing, it thinks it prevents presents global opinion on it, it shapes global opinion on things, and this translates into similar legislations and laws or actions by the Supreme Courts in different countries. And this is how there is, let's say, a steering towards a common goal and steering towards, let's say, fulfillment of human rights globally. Now, another important job of the United Nations is the economic development and the humanitarian assistance. Okay, so now obviously for this there have been numerous bodies created under the UNG and ECOSOC. Let's focus at few important bodies. The first one, so the first thing that I want to discuss here is that the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. Okay, Sustainable Development Goals are basically a set of 17 goals that have been adopted by the United Nations, and it fixes a moral responsibility on countries to make sure that these 17 goals are attained and achieved by 2030. Okay, now the seriousness of the Sustainable Development Goals is that Niti Aayog has released on December 30, 2019, the second edition of the SDG, which is Sustainable Development Goal India Index, which is a comprehensive document which traces the progress that India has made in the fulfillment of its commitments towards the 17 goals. Okay, now so I think this report is very important. The question could be that the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal India Index, has been released by, and you should know that Niti Aayog is the body that has released this index. Okay, now as per this index, I want to share a little bit more. It basically says that India's score has improved from 57. So there are multiple parameters on which this scoring has done. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that in 2018 India's score was 57, and in 2019 the score is 60. So India has basically done a reasonably good job in fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goals. Now the maximum gains that have been made in India is in goal number 6, which is clean water and sanitation. So you can relate Swachh Bharat with it. Then goal 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. So you can have Bharatmala project, etc., infrastructure spending. Then you have Make in India, etc. Okay, and 7, affordable and clean energy. You can find the so Ujjwala scheme, for example, is basically a result of India trying to fulfill these games. So this is how the Sustainable Development Goals and the sort of deliberations and the resolutions and the conventions that are adopted to the United Nations, this is how it translates into action at the ground level in the member states. Okay, now another important program is the UNDP, United Nations Development Program. It's basically, it's a very successful program in the sense that it's a grant-based technical assistance program which is founded in 1945. So under this program, certain specific grants are given for infrastructure development, healthcare development, etc., in developing countries. So these grants are given by the United Nations, and then these are generally followed by loans from linked organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, etc., right? So UNDP publishes the UN Human Development Index. Human Development Index is the index which basically measures the, let's say the sort of standard of life that people enjoy in every country. So the important question that can come out of here is that which entity or which body of the United Nations publishes the United Nations Human Development Index, commonly also known as the HDI. So the answer here would be UNDP. Now there is another important organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which was founded in 1945. It promotes agricultural development and food security. So I think this organization is going to have a big role to, as in it's been playing a really big role. But if you look at countries like India, which are going to face, there are possibilities that there would be challenges to food security. This organization is going to play a major role in these sort of problems that might emanate in the future. Okay. Then last but not the least, you have the UNICEF, which is basically United Nations Children's Fund. So originally it was created in 1946 to aid post-war European children, right? However, now its mandate has expanded and it provides help to children across the world. Now then you have World Food Program, which was created in 1961. So this basically, according to their data, is responsible for feeding 90 million people each year. So whenever there is famine, whenever there are natural disasters, whenever there are armed conflict, let's say in Syria and Yemen, where people are starving to death, the World Food Program goes there and tries to feed as many people as possible. Okay. Then there is the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Now, this is very important because in the last decade or so, we are seeing multiple conflicts, let's say in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, which are creating a lot of refugee crisis, right? So if you look at the migrant crisis that is at the doorstep of Europe, it is basically a result of the Syrian conflict. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has a great role to play in mitigating this refugee and migrant crisis, right? Now, uh, uh, yeah, so give me 5 more minutes, and this is basically the last thing that we'll discuss today. This is the World Health Organization. Okay, so World Health Organization has really been in the news. There are certain allegations that have been made against the World Health Organization with regards to its handling of the corona COVID-19 pandemic, right? So before this, the World Health Organization was considered to be one of the most successful United Nations bodies. There wasn't a lot of criticism against it, and the World Health Organization had generally done a lot of good things, right? Just say, for example, in 1980, after sustained efforts made by the United Nations, made by the WHO, it said that we have eradicated smallpox. Then subsequently, WHO and its global effort has led to the eradication of polio, river blindness, and diseases like leprosy. So until now, the WHO had a fundamental and commendable record, but then the pandemic crisis hit, right? So let me try to explain to you what are the allegations against the World Health Organization. So, like, please remember, it is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, right? And it's so basically the mandate of the WHO is to make sure that there is betterment in universal healthcare. It is supposed to monitor public health risk. It's supposed to tell the world if there is a public health risk, right? And if there is public health risk, it's supposed to coordinate a global effort to fight that public health risk, right? Now, it provides technical assistance. It sets international health standards and guidelines, etc. So and it collects important data which policymakers can use to make policies to tackle universal health crisis, right? So let me tell you what exactly this entire crisis that we've seen in the news all about. So basically, and one of the things that has happened is Donald Trump has said that I am going to hold and withdraw funding of the WHO, right? So United States is the biggest, as in it's the biggest contributor to the WHO, which is closely followed by China, right? So the current crisis is that there are allegations on the WHO that it basically did not, let's say, do an independent verification of the data that was provided by the Chinese. It basically took China at face value, right? When China said that there is no pandemic, and even in, let's say, mid-January, China had come out and said that there is no proof of human-to-human transmission. And this is a time when China was in the stage of community transmission, right? So the primary allegation is that the WHO praised Chinese efforts. It's been saying that China has done a good job, and it's been taking the data and the numbers, etc., provided by China at face value, right? So one of the reasons that this probably has happened, now all of this is speculation, right? But so there is this author called Brahma Chelani. He's a very intelligent and reputed geostrategist. So he generally writes in global newspapers and magazines all across the world. So according to him, he says that the current director, who is Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, he is the former health minister and foreign minister of Ethiopia, who began his 5-year term on 1st July 2017. So now Brahmachelani says that this was, and he was elected with support from China, right? Now, if we've looked at China in our previous videos, and we've seen how China plays its, let's say, sort of uh, diplomacy by throwing money at people, right? So China has invested heavily in Ethiopia, right? So basically, Ethiopia is probably falling under a debt trap, just like Sri Lanka, which had to then lease out the Hambantota port. So this guy, Mr. Tedros Adhanom, he was also, as I told you, he was the foreign and health minister of Ethiopia. Now, it is alleged that, and there are allegations against him, there are cases against him in his country, that he suppressed the data from 3 cholera outbreaks in Ethiopia, right? So what he's done right now by suppressing data from China regarding COVID pandemic, there is precedent in his lifetime only, when he was the health minister of Ethiopia, that he suppressed data from 3 cholera outbreaks. Now, why he's able to do this is, as why he is doing is one of the reasons is that China helped him to become, and so not him, China helped Ethiopia to become the chairperson or the director of the World Health Organization, and Ethiopia is sort of repaying China back because Ethiopia doesn't have the money to repay China, right? repay China's debt. So this is how Ethiopia is trying to pay back China so that China reduces Ethiopia's debt obligation. So these are allegations that are made against the WHO. Another interesting thing about Mr. Tedros is that in the history of the World Health Organization, he is the first and the only non-physician director, right? He's the only non-doctor who's been made director of the WHO. Now, there is another section on the United Nations Environment Program. I think I'll not talk about this today because I want to anyways make a separate video on climate change, because that is also a very important topic. Before Corona had happened, climate change was the burning issue. And it's very likely that there'll be questions out of climate change, right? So I'll not focus on it here because I want to specifically focus on climate change because there's a lot to discuss there and a lot of facts to be provided to you and a lot of conceptual understanding is required. So Harsh, this is pretty much what I had to talk to people in this video, and I'm open to any sort of questions and doubts that people have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session.